Page 16. Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, by David Benatar, 2006. Chapter 1. 1.1. Who is so lucky? A version of the view I defend in this book is the subject of some humor. Life is so terrible, it would have been better not to have been born. Who is so lucky? Not 1 in 100,000. Sigmund Freud describes this quip as a nonsensical joke, which raises the question whether my view is similarly nonsensical. Is it sheer drivel to say that coming into existence is a harm and thus that it is better never to come into existence? Many people think that it is. Much of the argument in Chapter 2 will show that they are mistaken. But first some ground must be cleared of confusion. Dr. Freud says that anybody who is not born is not a mortal man at all, and there is no good and no best for him. Ibid. Although this is the deepest concern Dr. Freud has with the quip, he has others too. These, however, arise from his version of the quip, which sounds particularly nonsensical. He says, never to be born would be the best thing for mortal men. But, adds the philosophical comment in Fliegende, this happens to scarcely one person in 100,000. Ibid. The embellishment that never being born happens to scarcely 1 in 100,000 does add to the joke's incongruity. Never being born happens to not 1 in 100,000, and not to scarcely 1 in 100,000. James Strachey describes the Fliegende as a well-known comic weekly. I leave to others the minor, but interesting, historical question whether the Fliegende drew on Jewish wit or whether it was the source of this particular piece of Jewish humor, or whether both draw on some other source. Here Dr. Freud anticipates an aspect of what is called the non-identity problem, which I shall discuss at length in Chapter 2. Some contemporary philosophers offer a similar objection when they deny that one could be better off not being born. The never-existent cannot be benefited and cannot be better off. I shall not claim that the never-existent literally are better off. Instead, I shall argue that coming into existence is always bad for those who come into existence. In other words, although we may not be able to say of the never-existent that never-existing is good for them, we can say of the existent that existence is bad for them. There is no absurdity here, or so I shall argue. Once we acknowledge that coming into existence can be a harm, we might then want to speak loosely about never coming into existence being a better. This is not to say that it is better for the never-existent, nor that the never-existent are benefited. I grant that there is even something odd about speaking about the never-existent, because that is surely a referentless term. There clearly are not any never-existent people. It is, however, a convenient term, of which we can make some sense. By it we mean those possible people who never become actual. With this in mind, consider the joke again. It can be viewed as making two claims, 1, that it is better not to be born, and, 2, that nobody is lucky enough not to be born. We now see that there is a loose sense in which one can say that it is better not to be born. It is an indirect way of saying that coming into existence is always a harm. And there is nothing nonsensical in claiming that nobody is lucky enough never to have come into existence, even though it would have been playful nonsense to claim that there are some people who are lucky enough not to come into existence. In any event, the fact that one can construct a joke about the view that coming into existence is always a harm, does not show that that view itself is laughable nonsense. Although we can laugh at silliness, we can also laugh about very serious matters. It is into the latter category that I place jokes about the harm of coming into existence. There are other such jokes. For example, it has been joked that life is a sexually transmitted terminal disease. In cases of artificial reproduction, life is not sexually transmitted, but it remains a terminal disease. Others have jested that we are born cold, naked, hungry, and way too, and that it is downhill from there. Although neonates cry not from a recognition of this, their cries, on my view, are ironically appropriate. Lest it be thought that the arguments I advance are intended as mere philosophical games or jokes, I should emphasize that I am entirely serious in my arguments, and I believe the conclusions. I am serious about these matters because what lies in the balance is the presence or absence of vast amounts of harm. I shall show in Chapter 3 that each life contains a great deal of boredom, much more than people usually think. The only way to guarantee that some future possible person will not suffer this harm is to ensure that that possible person never becomes an actual person. Not only is this harm all readily avoidable, but it is also so utterly pointless, at least if we consider only the interests of the potential person and not also the interests others might have in that person's coming into existence. As I shall show in Chapter 2, the positive features of life, although good for those who exist, cannot justify the negative features that accompany them. Their absence would not have been a deprivation for one who never came into existence. It is curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one, and only, guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is not to bring those children into existence in the first place. Rivka Weinberg makes a similar point when she says that many of the parents who are willing to make huge sacrifices for the sake of their desperately ill children may never consider that the most important sacrifice they ought to make is not to create these desperately ill children in the first place. A Procreative Justice, a Contractualist Account, Public Affairs Quarterly, 16/4, 2002, 406. Her point is more restricted than mine because she applies it only to desperately ill children, whereas I would apply it to all children. There are many reasons why people do not notice this, or why, if they do notice it, that they do not act on the realization, but the interests of the potential children cannot be among them, as I shall argue. Nor is the harm produced by the creation of a child usually restricted to that child. The child soon finds itself motivated to procreate, producing children who, in turn, develop the same desire. Thus any pair of procreators can view themselves as occupying the tip of a generational iceberg of suffering. I owe the image of the iceberg to University of Cape Town geneticist Raj Ramza. He uses it to represent the relationship between carriers of a genetic disorder and their potential or actual offspring. I have broadened the image to apply not only to those with genetic disorders but to all those members of sentient species with genes. They experience the bad in their own lives. In the ordinary course of events they will experience only some of the bad in their children's and possibly grandchildren's lives, because these offspring usually survive their progenitors. But beneath the surface of the current generations lurk increasingly larger numbers of descendants and their misfortunes. Assuming that each couple has 3 children, an original pair's cumulative descendants over 10 generations amount to 88,572 people. That constitutes a lot of pointless, avoidable suffering. To be sure, full responsibility for it all does not lie with the original couple because each new generation faces the choice of whether to continue that line of descendants. Nevertheless, they bear some responsibility for the generations that ensue. If one does not desist from having children, one can hardly expect one's descendants to do so. Although, as we have seen, nobody is lucky enough not to be born, everybody is unlucky enough to have been born, and particularly bad luck it is, as I shall now explain. On the quite plausible assumption that one's genetic origin is a necessary, but not sufficient, condition for having come into existence, 8 one could not have been formed by anything other than the particular gametes that produced the zygote from which one developed. This implies, in turn, that one could not have had any genetic parents other than those that one does have. It follows from this that any person's chances of having come into existence are extremely remote. The existence of any one person is dependent not only on that person's parents themselves having come into existence and having met, but also on their having conceived that person at the time that they did. Derek Parfit asks, say, how many of us could truly claim even if railways and motor cars had never been invented, I would still have been born. Think of how many people are conceived because of a power failure, a nocturnal noise waking their parents, or any other such opportunity merging with urge. Indeed, mere moments might make a difference to which particular sperm is instrumental in its conception. The recognition of how unlikely it was that one would have come into existence, combined with the recognition that coming into existence is always a serious harm, yields the conclusion that one's having come into existence is really bad luck. It is bad enough when one suffers some harm. It is worse still when the chances of having been harmed are very remote. Now there is something misleading about this observation. This is because of all the trillions of possible people who could have come into existence and assessed the odds. Every one of those who is in a position to assess the odds is unlucky, whereas there exists nobody whom the odds favored. 100% of assessors are unlucky, and 0% are lucky. In other words, given procreation, there was an excellent chance that somebody would be harmed, and although the chances of any person coming into existence are small, the chances of any existing person having been harmed are 100%. Page 21.